Why do we drink? That's the big question, isn't it? Aside from the addictive properties of alcohol itself, what makes us decide to bring a bottle of wine to a dinner party? Or to take 5 shots of tequila at the club? Or to end a long day of work with a scotch on the rocks? Is it for the taste? Couldn't be. For the buzz? Possibly. But the urges and cravings to drink are ubiquitous. And if you're anything like me, you've succumbed to those desires on many an occasion. Welcome to Stone Cold Moderation, a thinking man's journey toward a healthier relationship with alcohol. I'm your host, Chase Lee. Let's continue with our discussion. The truth is, it's never just one thing. As deeply as drinking is embedded in our culture, so too is the motivation to consume. And, if you're anything like me, you've also been overwhelmed by how many situations call for a drink. And if your alcohol abuse has spun out of control, every waking moment might call for a drink. One of the first steps in solving a problem is to define the problem and assess why it exists in the first place. If we can understand why it's so hard to refuse a Jell-O shot at a house party, to get a grasp on what exactly is going on in our minds at that moment, perhaps we can gain greater control over our urges. So, to discuss drinking motives in great depth, I invited on a bona fide expert, Dr. Lynne Cooper, whose research over several decades has focused broadly on risk-taking and adjustment, especially among young adults. Here was our conversation. All right, so today, very special guest on the show. Very honored to have Dr. Lynne Cooper with us today. Lynn, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Excellent. Just before we kind of get into the questions talking about your research, did you want to just maybe take a moment to introduce yourself? Where are you right now? And maybe just give like a brief, although you've had a very long and successful career, maybe just discuss a little bit like what your research has been focused on.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm at home, sheltering in place, as many people around the world are, in Oakland, California. And the nice thing for me today is that my son is here visiting, so that's a good thing.
That is
That's
a good
pleasure.
thing.
Yes. But in any event, I have a PhD in psychology and a master's degree in public health, and I was interested always in kind of understanding the processes, the underlying sort of psychological and social effects on health behaviors and decisions people make about their health behaviors, and in particular, why people engage in behaviors that have clear demonstrable risk associated with them. Like, why would people choose to do things that could end up harming themselves, you know? And so I really, if you sort of take it at the, at the bird's eye view, I would say that would be the driving force to most of the work I've done, is trying to understand the answer to that question, which seems is kind of it's a conundrum. To me, it presents a conundrum. Like, why would people choose to do things that could hurt themselves? But turns out it has we don't really, I wouldn't say we know the answer to that question, but it turns out there are lots of complicated, interesting, and intersecting possible answers to that question. Mm-hmm. So it's certainly been enough to consume quite a few years of my life trying to gain some insights into that question.
Yeah, and sort of to guide our discussion today, you sent me 2 of your articles, which we're going to talk about. And the first one is from the Oxford Handbook of Substance Use Disorders. And it was written by you and several other researchers. And it's called Motivational Models of Substance Abuse, a review of theory and research on motives for alcohol use, marijuana, and tobacco. Whew. Yes, and I will certainly leave a link to this in the show notes of this episode for people who want to read more scholarly works like this. Yeah, so I wanted to start talking about that. So in this article, you guys, so you and your crew, you talk about the Cox and Klinger motivational model of alcohol use. It's kind of a central topic of this review. Could you talk a little bit about what that is, and just give like a brief summary, I guess?
Sure. The model first published back in about 1988, so pretty old work. But it was just it was basically these guys, Cox and Klinger's attempt to answer the question about why people drink. What are the motives that underlie and drive alcohol use among the average person or among most people? And what they hypothesized was that there are really kind of two dimensions that underlie drinking, and these motivational dimensions, and they are basically what's called a approach avoidance motivation on the one hand, and the other is sort of a focus on incentives, or incentives being sort of things that incentivize behavior, things that you can get by engaging in a behavior that are either sort of more internal to the person or more external and typically social. So that's sort of this internal social dimension and this approach avoidance dimension. And approach avoidance has to do with the basic thing of whether or not the goal that you're seeking is something you're trying to avoid, a negative or painful or aversive outcome that you don't want to experience. So you're engaging in behaviors in order to avoid something, versus approach is, something that's positive and pleasurable that pulls you towards it. And so you're engaging in a behavior to get this positive outcome. So those turn out to be two really fundamentally different sorts of dynamics. Whether you're doing something in order to avoid a negative or you're doing something in order to pursue a positive outcome. And then the other dimension is this idea of whether or not that outcome is something that more resides inside of you, that's internal to you, versus something that is more of a social outcome. And so if you cross those two dimensions, the approach avoidance and the internal self-focus versus the other or social focus, it implies that there could be or should be 4 different categories of motives, broad categories of motives. So if you think first on the approach side, behavior you engage in order to get a positive outcome, if it's internally focused, so that gives rise to a motive that we've labeled enhancement. And enhancement motives are about pursuing something that is personally rewarding to you. So whether it's because drinking, let's say, feels good, or it's fun, or, certain pleasurable sensations, like you like the feeling of being high, or you like that feeling of that buzz that you get when you drink. So those would be the kinds of reasons that that fall under that rubric of enhancement motives. And then the other approach motive is the approaching a positive that is related to a social connection, or a social bond, or a social outcome that you want, that you value, and that you're trying to get. So, there you could just think about things like, drinking with your friends because it's a way to kind of bond with your friend or build solidarity with your friend. Just sort of hanging out with your bud is a positive thing, and it has positive social gains for you potentially, right? So those are the two approach motives. And so you've got enhancement and social motives. And then on the avoidance side, if it's something you're trying to avoid, a negative thing you're trying to avoid that sort of resides inside of you, we think of those motives as, we call them coping motives. So that's about, you are feeling you're feeling anxious or you're feeling depressed, and you think, oh, drinking might make these feelings go away, right? So you're trying to avoid feeling that way, or, you're fearful. You come home, maybe to an empty house, and you're like, oh, it's going to be really kind of depressing and lonely being here this evening all by myself. So I think I'll have a few drinks.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could be something that you're actually experiencing and you're seeking something negative you're experiencing, you're seeking relief from it, or it could be something you anticipate you're going to feel negative in a certain way, and you could drink in order to avoid that feeling. But whatever the precise dynamics are, the idea is that you're drinking to avoid some kind of negative internal feeling state.
Right.
Avoid or escape. And then the other avoidance motive is about avoiding a negative social outcome. So, for example, if you are in a social setting and, your friends are putting pressure on you to drink or kidding you and, whatever, and you're worried about maybe somehow alienating your friends or, creating a bad social image if you don't, join in and look like you're having fun or whatever in that situation, then you might drink in order to avoid a negative social outcome. And we call those motives conformity motives. You're drinking to conform to the norms in the situation and avoid possible negative outcomes associated with not conforming.
Yeah. Because it seems to me that I'm a member now of like all of these kind of like Facebook groups, for like, people who are in recovery and whatnot. So I have a lot of conversations with people, and I read a lot of what people say. And like, for example, I'm kind of practicing what I call moderation, right? So I'm not drinking very much, and I've kind of changed my drinking habits over the last 8 months or so. But a lot of people think that's not possible, right? A lot of people, especially in like the sober living community, who are just alcohol free completely. And they say that one of their main arguments is that like alcohol provides no benefits. They call it benefits, quote unquote, to the user, right? But it kind of seems to me that these approach motives and conformity motives, like those are, in a sense, like beneficial to the user because it's I guess like providing like a reward. Like there's obviously a reason why people are drinking, because it does something positive for them. Is that
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think, if alcohol didn't provide compelling rewards or benefits, it wouldn't be an issue, right?
Yeah.
Nobody would be an alcoholic,
No.
right? It's like, why would people drink if it didn't offer any rewards, right?
Yeah.
But, when people say it doesn't offer any benefits, they may be stepping back and taking a bigger view, and saying, well, relative to its potential cost, and especially its cost for people who may be more vulnerable to problems or may have a history of problems, you could imagine that the cost-benefit ratio is not a positive one, right? Mm-hmm. But to say it doesn't have any benefits, I think is patently probably not true.
Yeah. And that was really interesting for me. So reading this article that you wrote, it was really interesting for me. And I think when people say that, they're talking about like, well, it doesn't make, it's not going to make you taller, or it's not going to give you like vitamin A. Well, I guess maybe people think it does, like those kind of benefits, right? But So, anyways, I found that very, very interesting that you guys lay that out very clearly. And of the 4 categories of drinking motives that you just talked about, the Cox and Klinger model, which are the most commonly endorsed in the research, and also what does that mean?
Yeah, well, it's actually, there's very, very clear and consistent evidence on that question, which is somewhat unusual in scientific research to really have a preponderance of the evidence say the same thing. So this is something where, across many, many countries and, many different kinds of samples, whether you're looking at adolescents or college students or young adults in a community, You find oh, I just saw a bird fly in the front
Oh.
door.
Uh-oh, you gotta call Aaron.
Uh-oh. Well,
Come log it.
that's interesting. Hang on one second.
Okay.
Let me.
No worries.
Aaron, a bird just opened the front door. What was it? It looked like a hummingbird. It just hit the front window.
Okay.
So, should I just start from the beginning?
Yeah. Or
Is that easier for you if you?
no, or you can just continue because I can edit it.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay, so sorry about that, but
No
that was
worries.
kind of. I'm like, oh my God, that bird just flew in the front door. Okay, so in any event, so what I was saying is that there's a lot of consensus about the rank order of these, and by that I just mean that it's pretty clear what are the most commonly reported reasons why people drink versus the less common reasons. And that order is that social and enhancement, the two approach reasons, the reasons, that the motivations to pursue some sort of positive outcome are the most prominent reasons people drink. And there, as I said, that's pretty universal across most of the work that's been done, although there is a caveat there in that most of the work that's been done has been done with people within a certain age range, sort of adolescents, high school students, young adults, or late adolescents, 18, 19 years old, college students, and into emerging adulthood. So sort of bracketing from, let's say, 12 or 13 years old on the young side to 25 or 26 on the older side. And of course, work has been done outside those ranges, but that's where the majority of the work has been done. So in any event, there you have the approach reasons predominate as the main reasons people report drinking. And then after that, drinking to cope is less commonly endorsed, but that's the third most common reason. And finally, conformity motives are the least common reasons that people report drinking. And there you see for the other three reasons, for social enhancement and coping, you see generally an increase in the rates of endorsement with age and with drinking experience. But for conformity motives, it's actually those reasons are more commonly reported by younger adolescents. So pressures to conform and concerns about fitting in sort of peak developmentally around like 12, 13, something like maybe even a little younger. Mm-hmm. So that's when people report drinking to conform the most, is in those very young adolescents. So it seems to follow a pretty different pattern than the other motives.
Yeah. And while I was reading this, I was kind of interested in how do you guys measure this, and also how, I mean, when people are choosing to drink or not drink, are they fully conscious of their motives, or so how do you measure these things?
Mm-hmm. That's a really, really good question, Chase, and I'm glad you asked it, because I think there's some really couple of important points related to that question. So the way that we ask it, the way that it's measured, is we just present you with a list of reasons that sort of reflect these four general categories. So in the measure that I published in 1994, I think it was, we had 5 questions that were aimed at assessing each of the 4 motives. So it's a 20-item measure. I can send you a copy of that if you want, cool. Just so you can see it for yourself. So in any event, we might say, well, thinking about all the times that you drank in the last 6 months or so, how often would you say you drank because you felt upset? So you drank to feel better, because you were depressed, because you were feeling upset, because you were feeling stressed out. So those might be the kinds of items that you would ask about that. Whereas you would say, well, how often in the last 6 months did you drink because you enjoyed the feeling of being high because you wanted to feel high, because you wanted to, party. Or how often did you drink because you wanted to share that experience with a friend or celebrate a special occasion with a friend, or, to feel closer to a friend. And then for the conformity items, the questions ask something like, well, how often did you drink because you were afraid that others would kid you or tease you, if you didn't drink, or that, people might think badly of you in some way if you didn't drink. And so, and then we just give them what's called a relative frequency, scale. So people are saying, well, no, I never did that, or I almost never did it, or I did it a few times, or I did it, about half the time, or I did it a lot of the time, or most of the time, or no, I always drink for that reason, right? So that's a basic way that it's measured. So what we call these motives, or this way of measuring it, is they're called self-attributed motives. So these are the reasons that people sort of tell themselves that they drink. They're the ways that people understand their own drinking behavior or make sense of their drinking behavior, right? And that doesn't mean necessarily that those are the reasons, let's say deep down inside, that necessarily drive their drinking, or that that may really motivate their drinking in the first place, that because they may not have full access to those reasons, right? So there's the kind of unconscious part of motivation, and sometimes people call that implicit motivation. So there's sort of the things that operate outside of conscious awareness that drive our behavior. And then there are these explicit reasons that or ways that we make sense of what we do. So and there's been a lot of research looking at the relationships between implicit motives and explicit motives, these things that operate outside of consciousness and our conscious reasons, and then our explanations for our behavior, both in the alcohol field but just more generally, because it's a broad question, that people are interested in with regard to motivation in general. Yeah. And what you find is that they're not necessarily but implicit motivations are really hard to measure, as you could imagine, and they tend to really measure things at a cruder level. So it's sort of like either you have sort of a positive bias towards something, or you have a negative bias. So it's really hard to pull apart at an implicit level the kinds of distinctions we're talking about between, let's say, if you have a sort of a positive approach response to alcohol cues in a laboratory study, people might say, oh, you're positively predisposed to these alcohol cues, so you have this positive motivation or inclination to drink. But it's harder to pull apart types of positive motivations like we do in the explicit motivation approach, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I always like to tell people is that what we study here is really important, regardless of how well it maps onto those unconscious motives that may drive your behavior, right? Because what we've been able to show is that how you come to understand your behavior and explain it to yourself, regardless of how veridical those explanations are, right? How well they map onto what really drove you to drink in those situations, that those explanations have really powerful effects, right? So, in my own work, for example, where I've followed adolescents from, let's say, an average age of, 15 or 16 years old until they were 30, okay? And I can show that the motives that people reported for drinking when they were 15 or 16 years old predicts their level of alcohol problems when they're 30.
Hmm.
Okay. So those explanations, in a sense, they take on a life of their own, even if they're not accurate. I mean, that's sort of like part of the power of how we frame and understand things, right? So that's one thing that I think is really important to bear in mind, is that these may not be always to bear a clear relationship with these unconscious motives, but they are important in their own right. And, there's a lot of evidence to support that.
Yeah. Now, and that was interesting. That's interesting to hear that and to read about this, because now it's like on these Facebook groups, there's so many people commenting about their drinking and talking about like, oh, I don't know why I'm drinking. I just don't understand myself. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, those, yeah, like to hear you explain that is pretty fascinating, because yeah, I mean, a lot of people out there are, well, in terms of their own lives, like kind of lost, right? And they really don't understand where their drinking comes from and what the source of it is. And they obviously see like the consequences, but they're a little bit confused as to where it comes from.
Well, I think it raises a really interesting question in my mind, because just thinking about how we measure this, because when we, let's say, give this measure to people, it's I mean, we sort of force them to answer these questions, right? I mean, so, they have to say, well, no, they have to give some kind of an answer, and it's not open-ended. We don't say, well, why do you, tell us why you do drink, right? Although that's been done, and I've done that too, and I did that as a first step actually towards developing this measure.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't just take this theoretical model and go, okay, I'm going to, like create 5 items to measure coping motives. I, in fact, first started by going and asking people in open-ended ways.
Oh.
Well, tell me about, in this particular situation, for example, the last time you drank, what was going on for you? Why were you drinking? What do you think, you were trying to get out of drinking in that situation? What needs was it serving for you? And then coded those to see if they, in fact, mapped onto the categories that this theoretical model predicted. And they did, and it wasn't that they, that the reasons, that every single reason every person gave fit into one of those 4 categories, but those were the most common reasons that people gave. And then other reasons were, seemed more idiosyncratic, and they were, like one person said this, or, a person reports 3 motives and their third reason was something that kind of didn't fit or have any bearing on the model. So it's not that people don't drink for other reasons, but it does look like that those are really common reasons. But people, I think, don't often reflect on it. And for example, when we give them this measure, we don't have an option that says, I don't know why I drink.
Oh yeah.
I have no idea why I drink. It would be really interesting to add an option like that and see, what that relates to and what that predicts, what kind of pattern of drinking it predicts or is associated with. I don't know. That would be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, you also talk about, specifically in this article, you talk about the difference between expectancies for drinking and motives for drinking, which I also found pretty fascinating. So could you just, kind of explain for us what are the difference between those two things?
Well, expectancies are beliefs we hold about the effects of alcohol. And those beliefs could be either positive or negative in nature. So, for example, you could believe that, drinking will help you feel better if you're feeling upset, or that drinking will make a social occasion more fun, right? So those are positive expectancies. They're expectancies about good things that are going to happen, or that often happen or typically happen if you drink. But then people also have negative expectancies, beliefs that certain bad things will happen. Like if I drink, I'm much more likely to do something stupid, right? I'm much more likely to, get in an accident. I'm much more likely to be rude to my friend when I don't really mean to be. I'm much more likely to, whatever, do something untoward. But so those are the beliefs that people hold, but motives, as I've described them and as they're operationalized generally in the field, are things like, I drink in order to achieve this outcome. And people typically only drink in order to achieve benefits, right? People don't drink intentionally to have negative consequences. They drink intentionally likely to occur, right? So they're not drinking for those negative, to achieve those negative outcomes. They're drinking in order to achieve the positive outcomes and believe the negative ones are unlikely or that they can be controlled, right? So you see a relationship between beliefs about the positive effects of alcohol and motives for drinking, but not so much about the negative, right? Because people don't drink in order to achieve negative, to have bad things happen to them. Right. So basically what we see is I think a very reasonable in terms of sort of understandable relationship between expectancies and motives, in that, if a person holds a particular relevant belief, like, let's say that drinking makes it easier to talk to somebody or to confide in somebody, right? That it's going to facilitate a social interaction, then they are more likely to drink for social reasons, right? To drink to bond with a friend or something. If they don't hold that belief, then they're not likely to drink for that reason. So there's this kind of this contingent relationship between them. But just because somebody holds the belief also doesn't mean that they're automatically going to drink for that reason, because maybe they, decided to moderate their use, or maybe they've have other ways of achieving closeness with a friend that they prefer, So it's sort of like a necessary, it's sort of a necessary but not sufficient link between expectancies, holding the belief, and then drinking in order to achieve that goal.
You also talk about you make a point somewhere in this article, I think near the end, that drinking motivated by avoidance goals, you say that that's particularly risky. Why might that be?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that there's been a lot of speculation about that, and I don't know that we really know the answer, but well, I'll say two things. You ask why that might be, but first let me just say that there is a lot of evidence that that is the case. That that's not just a speculation, that in fact, we show things. For example, I referred to the work that I've done earlier following adolescence over time. And we can show in that context that adolescents who strongly endorsed coping motives for drinking when they were 15 or 16 years old. So they said, I drink in order to feel better when I'm depressed, or I drink in order to cheer up, or I drink when I'm upset. Those adolescents, when they were 28, 30 years old, when they were young adults, they had more drinking problems than people who didn't report those reasons when they were adolescents, or endorse them less strongly, right? So, and that's just one example. There's other studies that have shown. There was one study that was done, I think it was done among medical students, and showed that among people that had no drinking problems, medical students had no drinking problems before entering into medical school. Those that still said, yeah, I drink to cope, I drink for these kinds of negative emotion regulation reasons before going into medical school and then trying to deal with the stress of medical school, they were much more likely to develop alcohol problems during the course of medical school than those who didn't endorse that reason. So there's a lot of evidence that does show that people who endorse these avoidant reasons have more problems, are more likely to have a problem. And the thing that's interesting is that if you are endorsing social reasons for drinking or you are endorsing enhancement reasons for drinking, you will drink more than people who don't endorse those reasons, right? So it's just, there's a really strong, clear, positive association between endorsing these motives and how much you drink. And people who drink more, on average, have more drinking problems, right? I mean, that just makes sense. So it's not that people who drink for approach reasons, for social or enhancement reasons, don't have more problems. They do. But the amount of problems they have, or the number of problems, or the severity of the problems they have is completely explainable by virtue of how much they drink. Right? So they have these problems. They're more likely to have problems because they drink more. That's not true for people who drink for avoidant reasons. So people that drink for avoidant reasons, they drink more than people who don't drink for those reasons, although that association isn't as strong. So they don't drink as much as people who drink to enhance, right? But still, they experience more problems. So there's basically an indirect effect. Yes, they have more problems because they drink, if you are high on coping motives or high on conformity motives. Well, let's stick to coping motives. Conformative motives are a little bit interesting in that regard. But for coping motives, if you're high on coping motives, yes, you're going to drink more. And because you drink more, you're going to have more problems. But it turns out there's also, you have more problems than you would predict just based on how much you drink. So there's this excess vulnerability that is, in statistical parlance, is a direct effect of endorsing these coping motives. So what does that mean? That's really the question. And, there are lots of different possible explanations and not a lot of work on it. So like I said, we know that it's associated with this excess vulnerability, but we know less about why it's associated with this excess vulnerability. And, one possibility is that coping motives are just indicative of kind of an underlying personality type that's prone to have more problems, right? So they're higher neuroticism, when people are higher neuroticism have higher levels of depression, higher levels of suicidal thoughts, higher levels of anxiety. And so maybe it's just partly the kind of people, but it's also possible that people who are drinking to cope with negative emotions are, in a sense, a little more desperate about their drinking, right? Because think about it, if you're really, really in distress, you are highly motivated to figure out something to do to feel better, right? And so if your coping mechanism is using alcohol, that's a situation in which because you're using it in a way where you're a little bit desperate, right? Because you really don't want to feel terrible, you really don't want to feel all these negative things. So that maybe you just make really bad decisions around using it because you're not, in a sense, sort of freely choosing it. You're kind of driven to use it because otherwise you feel terrible, right? So you're trying to escape something that's a powerful motivator and kind of maybe takes a little control away from you over that substance because you're leaning on it and using it, as a crutch. So that's one thought, is that literally that people who are using alcohol to escape, really aversive emotional situations or aversive social situations are not making the best decisions about how they use it because they don't have total control over it, Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. And you kind of actually already answered this question, but I was going to ask you, what is the explanation for why people who drink for avoidance goals, why, what makes them eventually become like worse drinkers. And you said like a little bit about like personality type,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I guess my question is why hasn't that part of the research been more? I guess why is there research missing there at this point?
Well, it's interesting. I did once with a colleague of mine. We wrote a grant proposal to actually study that, and it wasn't funded. So I'm sorry
Oh,
to say.
that's why. Okay.
I'm
Gotcha.
sorry to say that didn't get funded, but
Yeah.
because I think it's a really interesting question. But if it's not just personality, but it's something that happens in real time, right? When people drink and they're drinking for those kinds of reasons, they're making bad decisions, let's say for the conformity motive, for example. If somebody is drinking because they really want to fit in with a crowd and they don't want to be subject to, social ridicule, or, they just are doing it because they really want to fit in. That's a classic case where we know people make really bad decisions a lot of times, right? And again, it is something that you probably see more commonly, during adolescence and, maybe in college too. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how common that is, in certain college settings that where we know drinking is very normative, like in fraternity, in the Greek system, for example, and how much of the drinking that goes on there is really about just sort of fitting in and going along to get along. But we know that conformity motives are interesting because people who drink predominantly to conform are people who, by and large, don't have a lot of positive reasons to drink. It's like if you are really drawn to it because you find it socially gratifying and you find that it does help you connect with people and you find that you have more fun at a party and stuff like that, well, you don't peer pressure is in a way kind of irrelevant because you're doing it for your own reasons, right? People who are drinking to conform, they're people who generally don't have those positive associations so much. So they're not on their own drawn to it. They get themselves in situations where they drink because they feel like they don't want to be left out. They don't want to be ostracized. So they're not drinking because alcohol itself is so intrinsically rewarding to them. They're drinking because of that. So the thing that's interesting about conformative motives is that people that endorse conformative motives in general drink less than people who don't, right? But still, people who endorse conformative motives have more drinking problems. So that's what's really there's this very interesting, complicated set of relationships there. But I think it's because, the way I make sense of that pattern of data is that the people who are drinking to conform, just left to their own devices, don't drink that much. But they get themselves in a social setting where there's drinking and maybe heavy drinking going on. And so they kind of drink just to fit in. And then they really don't even maybe have the tolerance, and so they get more drunk than other people who are drinking similar amounts. Then their judgment is really impaired and they make really bad decisions and they do really dumb things. And so it's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting pattern, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, kind of segueing into my next question, and you already kind of answered it a few minutes back. But in this article, something that really struck a chord with me is you observe the relationship between neurotic behavior and substance abuse. And you guys basically say that, people who show signs of neuroses, is that how you say it?
Well, neuroses kind of has a slightly different
Oh,
meaning than from the personality, the assessment of neuroticism, because neuroticism is sort of characterized by this tendency to a predisposition to experience higher levels of negative emotions, to a predisposition toward emotional volatility. So lots of ups and downs in your moods. So a person who's kind of moody, a person who tends to be a little anxious, a person who tends to be, more depressive in nature, to get easily upset, a person who's a little maybe low self-esteem, a little insecure. So it's a whole cluster of things. That's what the personality trait neuroticism measures, and that's what we were looking at in that paper. Neuroses are more of a sort of a clinical. I mean, you think of more of a like somebody is super neurotic about a particular thing, or they have a particular obsessive concern about something. It's a more of a clinical construct than exactly what, I mean, they're related, but it's not exactly what we mean when we talk about neuroticism as a personality construct.
So I could just say like people who display neurotic behavior are more likely to drink.
Are more neurotic.
Okay. Yeah, because that struck a chord with me because I think I can be awfully neurotic sometimes. So I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So I guess what are the other personality types, if any, that you have observed that are more likely to have alcohol problems?
Well, I mean, I think the two motives that are most strongly associated with alcohol problems in general are enhancement motives and coping motives. And they're associated in the ways that I was describing, where people who drink to enhance tend to drink heavily. And because they drink heavily, they have problems. People who drink to cope may not drink quite as heavily as people who drink to enhance, but nevertheless, they have more problems than you would predict based on their consumption. So there's something that's qualitatively different about these two sort of styles or modes of drinking and their consequences, right? It's not just a strict quantitative difference between how much they drink. There's something that's really qualitatively unique. So if we look at what kinds of personality factors are associated with those two motives, which are the ones that, on average would pose the most risk for experiencing drinking problems, on the side of coping motives, it is neuroticism in particular, right? So it's people who are predisposed to experience a lot of negative emotions, obviously have a greater need to figure out how to cope with those emotions, and to the extent that, let's say, their learning history or their early experiences point to alcohol as an effective way to regulate negative emotions, or their genetics, their genes, and their body chemistry make alcohol particularly rewarding to them, right? So it's that combination of being predisposed to experience a lot of negative affect, or to get upset easily, or to be really moody, right? That makes, and then if you've got that combined with the learning history that says alcohol is a good way to deal with this, or the genes that make you particularly vulnerable to the effects of alcohol, then I think that's the sort of combination that makes a person really at risk. So we show definitely a strong effect between, or a strong link between, various aspects of neuroticism and coping motives, and to a lesser extent conformity motives. But we see both, that neuroticism is linked to both more strongly than it's linked to either of the approach motives. On the approach side, the approach side, enhancement and social motives, we see for enhancement in particular, because that's what I wanted to draw the parallel between. We see there that enhancement is more strongly related to personality characteristics like sensation seeking, which is a tendency to seek out intense experiences and to enjoy more intense experiences, or risk-seeking propensity. These are sort of aspects of in terms of the model the main model that people embrace of personality right now, the Big Five model, which is neuroticism, extroversion, openness, what am I forgetting? Agreeableness and conscientiousness. Okay, that extroversion is the super trait, if you want, kind of the big umbrella trait that includes things like sensation seeking and risk seeking propensity. And there's others that I'm forgetting right now. I have this chapter open here. I can look on this because I can't quite remember what the other ones are, some of the other specific.
You said it's the Big Five model?
Well, that's the Big Five model. I was just saying what encompasses excitement seeking, sensation seeking, and reward sensitivity. So people that are particularly, I mean, it's interesting because you think everybody is, this is going to sound tautological, but that everybody finds rewards rewarding, right?
Yeah.
And that's true. But in fact, some people find rewards more rewarding than others.
Yes.
And so, people that are particularly sensitive to rewards, they are people that report higher levels of enhancement motives in particular. So enhancement motives in general are related to this larger overarching personality construct we call extroversion, but the specific aspects or facets of extroversion that are most closely related are things like sensation seeking and adventure seeking and this reward sensitivity component.
Okay. Wow. That's a lot. And that's, no, that's extremely interesting to kind of reflect on and to kind of think about, like, I don't know, like, I don't know if in your research, like, you reflected on, like, where do I kind of fit in terms in the research, but I definitely, when I was reading your work, I was like, oh, okay, it definitely it's caused a lot of self-reflection, which I thought was really interesting and helpful again.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's important to bear in mind is that, we talk about these motives as if they're sort of discrete, that people either drink for this reason or this reason, but that is an oversimplification because there's also been a lot of research showing that that the reasons you drink can vary, right, from situation to situation. And so it's not like the way that I've measured it, right, it says, well, on average, most of the time, like, what are the reasons you're drinking, right? And that's a valid approach, right? And that's the kind of approach that's shown that these are stable individual differences. Like if I asked you today to fill out this measure and I came back to you a year from now or 2 years from now and asked you to fill it out, there would be a high degree of stability in your answers, right? The answers to those questions are just as stable, it turns out, as basic personality dispositions are. Now, that doesn't mean if you went into treatment or that you couldn't change, right? And you could, it's a reasonable target for intervention is to target the, kind of how people think about and the reasons that they're drinking or that's a reasonable target and it can change. But in general, they're very, very stable across time, these reasons. But even given that, it doesn't mean that your motivations for drinking don't vary. If you're sitting home tonight and you're having a drink, that the motives that are prompting that behavior may be very different than if you're, meeting a friend at a bar and it may depend on who the friend is. The motives could differ depending on who the friend is. And the motives could differ, if you're going on a date and, why you might drink and so on. So it's not like it's this fixed phenomenon or that, people only drink for one reason. It's just that there's kind of and if you want to think about it as an intrapersonal profile.
Hmm.
right? That, for you personally, right? It may be that you more often drink, to enhance or drink for social reasons than coping, or, maybe you're really a person who more often drinks for coping and not that often for enhancement because maybe you don't drink in social settings that often.
Yeah. And
So,
yeah, and like you said, those are kind of the real world applications for this research in particular, I think, right? Because for example, I've read some books and looked at some, I guess, like recovery programs, and I haven't been to rehab, obviously, and I don't know what that
mhm.
entails. But from what I've seen, a lot of it is kind of like using research such as this to help people identify why it is that they drink, and then sort of, I guess, focusing in on that as a means to hopefully further recovery.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, I mean, again, for me, seeing this from an academic perspective has been really, really fascinating. So yeah. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm glad.
And
It's not very often that we actually feel like anything that we write is even read by anybody, by another academic, much less that it's actually helpful in some way.
well, it's also funny because it's been 5 years since I've been in university, and it's like I haven't read any like scholarly works since then, right? So it was kind of funny because I was reading this and I was like, oh, I kind of missed this, right? Because yeah, but it's not. Yeah, I mean that's a challenge. That's one challenging part of it, but there's like so much to be learned. So yeah, I definitely know that people listening to this will find it extremely well. I think they'll find it extremely helpful because I did. All right, fantastic stuff. First of all, just an absolute pleasure to have a bona fide expert and authority on these matters onto my show. Um, I found it so informative, and as I was re-listening to the interview, I guess the first question that kind of popped up into my mind was, well, when Dr. Cooper was talking about how sometimes it's difficult for the public and the average Joe out there to kind of make sense of the research and how to apply it into our own lives, just as it's difficult sometimes for academics to speak to the public and to kind of cross that bridge and to make it more accessible and relevant. For me, I think it can be really fundamental into creating kind of like a drinking profile for oneself. So that I guess each time that you're gonna take a drink, you can kind of do a little introspection and say, why am I drinking? Why am I doing this? Right? Am I doing this to make this social occasion more interesting, to make it more fun? Am I doing this because I'm in a bad mood? I want to avoid my emotions. Um, and I think, yeah, if we can kind of create sort of a profile of this is why I drink, it can be really helpful the next time you find yourself really tempted and really having the urge to drink, but you don't really want to. So on that note, I really quickly wanted to repeat the Cox and Klinger 4 categories of motives, because I think they're pretty fundamental and worth repeating in this space. Number 1 is self-focused approach motivations, such as drinking, smoking, or other drugs to enhance physical or emotional pleasure or for excitement. And I'm reading straight from Dr. Cooper's article, which I will, of course, have a link for in the show notes on my website. Number 2 is self-focused avoidance motives, such as drinking, smoking, or using other drugs to cope with threats to self-esteem or to avoid or minimize negative emotions. For example, coping motives. Okay. Number 3 is social approach motives, such as drinking, smoking, or using other drugs as a way to bond with others or improve social gatherings. And number 4, social avoidance motives, such as drinking, smoking, or using other drugs to avoid social censure or to gain others' approval. For example, approval or conformity motives. Right. So those are the four, according to the Cox and Klinger model, the four categories of motives of why we drink. Kind of boiled down to that. And I think even more condensed, if I understood Dr. Cooper correctly, it's right. It's coming down to enhancement or avoidance. Are you drinking to enhance something, whether it be to enhance the experience of a party, whether it be to enhance, I guess, your own pleasure in any given moment, or are you drinking to avoid? Are you drinking to avoid certain negative emotions? I don't know, if you're having a existential crisis and you don't want to feel that right now, so you're going to drink. Or are you avoiding some sort of social punishment if you don't drink? For example, peer pressure. So I guess boiled down to those two things, I think that's really important because, I mean, looking back on, just recently, when I felt compelled to drink for whatever reasons, yeah, I can identify if I'm honest with myself, whether it was for an enhancement purpose or whether it was for an avoidance purpose. And of course, I guess these motives, I guess I didn't ask Dr. Cooper this, but it seems like, human beings are complex. And well, she did actually say this, human beings are very complex. The motives to drink are very complex. So at any given time, we could be drinking for any particular reason on the spectrum, right? One day we could be drinking for this reason. The next day we could be drinking for this reason because our emotions change, right? But still, I think if we use this model, we can still kind of identify patterns in our own drinking and say, well, this is the kind of drinker that I am. Like most of the time when I drink, it's for this reason. And some people already have kind of that power of introspection. I guess I'm assuming a lot of people don't. I know a lot of people don't because I see, people commenting on Facebook groups and talking about, I don't understand why I'm still drinking. Why do I keep doing this to myself? So yeah, what I'm trying to hammer home again is I think applying this research and understanding better why we drink at any given moment can be really powerful. And it's been helpful for me to have these discussions. So I hope you find it helpful as well. Another thing I wanted to address is the idea of the no benefits of drinking. So again, a common comment and topic of discussion on Facebook groups related to alcohol is that there's no benefits to drinking alcohol. Doesn't, do anything good for your health, doesn't make you smarter, doesn't make you sexier, doesn't really do anything for you concretely. No benefits. I think this conversation with Dr. Cooper kind of debunks that in a sense, because clearly, as the research shows, there are certain rewards, or at least perceived rewards, to drinking. You drink and the party is more fun. You drink and you have, more courage to go and talk to that girl. You drink and suddenly you forget about your worries in that moment. Okay. And those in a sense could be perceived as benefits, right? So I think the question should be the question should not be, are there benefits to drinking alcohol or not benefits? Because I would say kind of there are, because there's perceived rewards. I think the question should be, can you still achieve those things and attain those rewards without alcohol? I think that's the question. And of course, I'm here to tell you that yes, I believe you can. I believe you can unwind at the end of the day without having to drink a bottle of wine or even a glass of wine. There's other things you can do. As Laura from Club Soda said, you can have a glass of tea and do yoga. Have a mug of tea and do yoga. Excuse me. Can you muster up the courage to go and talk to that girl or that guy sober? Yes, you can. I think you can overcome those social fears without alcohol. Can you tell your friends to get off your ass and still have a great time at the party sober? Yes. And still connect with people? Yes. and still be the life of the party? Yes. Yes, you can. So yeah, every time I guess from now on, when I hear that idea that, well, there's no benefits to drinking, I would like to bring up those other points. Like, yeah, I think there are benefits to drinking. There's good things, at least in the moment, in the immediate, that will benefit you. But can you get those same things without alcohol? Yes, I believe so. That's my conclusion. My unscholarly conclusion there. Okay, final thoughts for this episode. The next time you feel pressure to drink, I challenge you to ask yourself why. Whether the pressure you are feeling is coming from an external source, perhaps a friend telling you to drink or risk being a party pooper, or an internal source, stress that you're going through, something you want to forget, get off your mind. Whatever the pressure may be, ask yourself, why am I doing it? And then ask yourself, is there another way to ease this pressure, right? Or to overcome this pressure? And you might find that there are very simple alcohol-free solutions to these temporary feelings, these temporary pressures and discomforts. You get home after a day of work, your boss was a dick. Instead of having a glass of wine, you go for a run, you work out, you come back, you feel amazing afterwards. You feel completely different. You've completely wiped clean your emotional slate, so to speak, in that moment. And you can get on with the rest of your evening feeling great about yourself. Instead of the glass of wine, which is going to turn into a second glass of wine, which is going to leave you feeling like shit and maybe hungover and with a worse night's sleep. And clearly other kinds of situations can be more complicated, especially social situations when people are pressuring you to drink. Peer pressure is tough, and we're going to actually devote an entire episode to that coming up. But the point is, if you commit yourself to overcoming these urges and for finding solutions that are alcohol-free, in which you're not submitting to your urges, I think you can start to create extremely healthy thought patterns and also physical habits that can lead you to either an alcohol-free existence or just a much healthier existence and a much healthier relationship with alcohol, which is what we're trying to gain here. So I challenge you the next time you're confronted with one of these situations to find another way. Socrates once said, "My friend, care for your psyche, know thyself. For once we know ourselves, we may learn how to care for ourselves." This has been the Stone Cold Moderation Podcast with Chase Lee. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check out the complete show notes of this episode on stonecoldmoderation.com, where you can learn more about us. For access to more content, please subscribe to our YouTube channels, check us out on all other social media platforms, and make sure to tune in next time. We'll be talking about how to start making a change.